In the dim, flickering light of a forgotten roadside diner, Detective Minch stared at the crime scene. It was the third one this week. No body, no struggle, just a single puddle of coffee and a missing left ear. On the counter sat a chunky ceramic mug. At first glance, it looked like a crude souvenir, but as Minch leaned closer, the painted face shifted. The wide, jagged mouth wasn't just a design, it was stained with a deep, iron-scented crimson. Minch reached for his notepad, but a wet, tearing sound stopped him. He watched in horror as the mug tilted itself toward a discarded evidence bag. A small, fleshy trophy, the victim's ear, slid across the Formica table, as if drawn by a magnet. The mug's ceramic teeth gnashed, and with a sickening crunch, the ear vanished into the dark liquid inside. Thirsty? A raspy voice echoed, though no one else was in the room. The detective drew his service weapon, but the mug began to hop, its base clicking rhythmically against the counter like a predator's heartbeat. It wasn't just a vessel for coffee anymore. It was a hungry porcelain parasite, and Minch realized too late why the previous victims never had the chance to scream. Detective Minch rounded the corner of the damp alleyway, his breath hitching as he saw it, a faint ceramic clinking sound echoing against the brick walls. There, hopping with a rhythmic, sinister grace, was the chipped porcelain mug that had eluded the precinct for weeks. It wasn't just a kitchen utensil. It was a cold-blooded vessel of chaos. Minch kept low, his rubber solace silent on the wet pavement. He watched as the mug paused in front of a rusted ventilation grate behind the old city library. With a sudden, forceful tilt, the mug wedged itself against a loose brick, triggered a hidden mechanism, and disappeared into the darkness of the foundation. He waited a beat and pried the grate open. Dropping into the crawl space, Minch clicked on his penlight. The hideout was a miniature macabre gallery. The killer mug sat atop a velvet-lined crate, surrounded by its trophies, a collection of bent silver spoons and stained sugar packets from every crime scene. But more chilling was the wall behind it, covered in tiny, smeared tea leaf blueprints of the mayor's kitchen. End of the line, Lefty? Minch growled, leveling his service weapon at the ceramic rim. The mug slowly rotated on the spot, its cracked handle twitching like a taunting finger. Just as Minch moved to grab it, the floor began to vibrate. He realized too late that the mug wasn't alone. Dozens of matching saucers began to slide out from the shadows, rattling with a predatory hunger. Minch's eyes darted around the cramped crawl space as the saucers circled him, their porcelain edges scraping against the concrete like sharpening knives. He realized he couldn't shoot his way out. One stray bullet would shatter the evidence, and he'd be buried under a mountain of sharp shards. His gaze landed on a heavy-duty industrial vacuum hose coiled in the corner, likely left behind by a frantic janitor years ago. Beside it sat a large, empty plastic storage bin used for archiving old library records. You think you're the only ones who know how to clean up? Minch grunted. With a burst of adrenaline, he kicked the storage bin into the center of the room. He grabbed the vacuum hose, shoved it into the exhaust port of a nearby ventilation fan, and reversed the flow. As the saucers lunged forward in a coordinated ceramic swarm, Minch swung the hose like a lasso. The sudden, powerful suction caught the leading saucers midair. One by one, they were slurped into the hose and spat out directly into the deep plastic bin. Clatter. Smash. The saucers tumbled over each other, trapped by the high, slick walls of the plastic that couldn't grip. The killer mug, the ringleader, saw its army disappearing and tried to bolt for the grate. Minch wasn't having it. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy-duty silicone coaster he'd been carrying for this exact moment. With the precision of a professional disc golfer, he flicked the coaster. It landed perfectly under the mug's base, breaking its friction with the floor. The mug spun wildly, losing its momentum. Minch lunged, slammed the lid onto the plastic bin, trapping the saucers, and then dropped a heavy evidence bag over the killer mug, pulling the drawstring tight. Case closed, Minch muttered, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow. Now let's see how you handle the heat in the precinct dishwasher. As Minch hauled the heavy bin toward the exit, a metallic clink resonated from beneath the pile of trapped, rattling saucers. It was a sharper, heavier sound than porcelain hitting plastic. Curious, he reached past the frantic ceramic edges and pulled a small object from the very bottom of the bin. His penlight caught the glint of gold. It wasn't a spoon or a sugar packet, it was a heavy, ornate signet ring, caked in dried tea leaves. Minch wiped the grime away with his thumb, and his blood went cold. Engraved on the face of the ring wasn't a family crest, but a tiny, perfect etching of a teaspoon crossed with a steak knife. Beneath the symbol, a single word was inscribed in elegant, looping script, Springfield. Minch stared at the ring. Springfield wasn't a person. It was the name of the prestigious finishing school where the police chief's daughter had just enrolled. This wasn't just a rogue kitchen appliance on a spree. The killer mug was an agent. a trained operative of an underground society he hadn't even known existed. Suddenly, the mug inside the evidence bag stopped struggling. It went perfectly still, and for the first time, Minch heard it, a faint electronic ticking coming from the hollow space of the handle. Minch knew he couldn't risk bringing a potential explosive back to the precinct, or worse, through the crowded city streets. He set the evidence bag on a damp wooden crate and drew his multi-tool. "Steady, Minch," he whispered to himself. "It's just a beverage container." But it wasn't. As he peeled back the bag, the ticking grew louder, a rapid click, click, click that felt like a heartbeat. He focused his light on the handle. Upon closer inspection, the crack in the porcelain wasn't a structural failure. It was a seam. Using the fine-tipped pliers on his tool, Minch delicately pried at the seam. With a hiss of pressurized air, the outer ceramic shell of the handle popped open like a locket. Inside wasn't gunpowder or wires. Instead, tucked into a hollowed-out chamber, was a micro-spool of high-tensile copper wire connected to a tiny, vibrating quartz crystal. But ticking was actually a high-frequency transmitter. Minch realized with a jolt of horror that the mug had been broadcasting his location this entire time. He leaned in closer and saw a miniature parchment scroll tucked behind the crystal. He pulled it out with tweezers and unrolled it. It wasn't a hit list. It was a receipt from an antique restorer dated 3 days in the future, and at the bottom a handwritten note in violet ink. "The set must be complete by midnight. Bring the detective's badge. It makes a fine coaster." A shadow fell across the ventilation grate above. The ticking suddenly shifted into a long, continuous whistle, a signal. Minch snapped his head upward, the beam of his penlight cutting through the dusty air toward the ventilation grate. For a split second, he saw them, a pair of polished black patent leather shoes standing perfectly still on the pavement above. But as he adjusted his light, a face leaned into the frame. It wasn't a hitman or a thug. It was a face he recognized from the gold-framed portraits in the precinct lobby. It was Mrs. Higgins, the precinct's veteran secretary, the woman who had served Minch his Earl Grey every morning for 15 years. She wasn't wearing her usual floral cardigan. She was clad in a sharp, charcoal gray tactical suit, her expression devoid of its usual grandmotherly warmth. In her hand, she held a delicate china teapot, its spout aimed directly down through the grate like the barrel of a silenced pistol. "I always told you, detective," she said, her voice echoing coldly in the crawl space, "that you should never leave your tea to get cold. It's a sign of a cluttered mind." Before Minch could reach for his holster, Mrs. Higgins tipped the teapot. Instead of tea, a thick, viscous green gas began to pour from the spout, heavy and fast, blanketing the floor of the hideout. "The Springfield Society doesn't like loose ends, Minch," she whispered, "and you've become a very messy spill." Minch coughed, his vision beginning to swim as the sweet-smelling gas filled his lungs. He looked down at the killer mug. In the green haze, it looked like the chipped porcelain was twisting into a smirk.